Well, hello, I'm Roy Harriman with Kansas City Hiker, and today I am delighted to be able to interview Seth Brooks, who is the author of the recent Falcon guide, Hiking Kansas, which I highly recommend. And so he's going to share his story and journey related to the book. But before we do that, I wanted to give Seth, if you can just give us a little bit of overview of your background and what you're doing right now, your interest in hiking in the outdoors.
Sure. So my interest in hiking and the outdoors really kind of started in Spain. I lived in Spain from 2013 to 2020, and I had hiked and spent time in the outdoors before that. But my interest was really cultivated in Spain. A large part of that was because of the Camino de Santiago. So in the early 2000s, I worked in electoral politics, and then I kind of decided that wasn't for me anymore. And so I went to Spain to hike the Camino to kind of figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And that's where I decided I wanted to be a Spanish teacher. I got an opportunity to go live in Spain, teach in their public school system. And so I lived there for 7 years and hiked all over the country. And then in 2020, obviously the COVID pandemic began, and I was already kind of leaning towards returning back to the United States. But when the pandemic broke out, I was like, well, I should probably just move back to be closer home to my parents, to my family, to my friends. And so I moved back in August 2020. I was looking for ways to keep active and keep outdoors and keep fit and keep mentally healthy as well. And so I'm from Nebraska originally. And so I moved back to Nebraska, but I live close to the Loess Hills in Western Iowa. So began hiking at different public areas in the Loess Hills, and I figured, well, this is a beautiful area that's, I think, underrated, that deserves a hiking guidebook. So I submitted a proposal to Falcon Guides for a hiking Loess Hills guidebook, and they enjoyed the proposal, but they thought that the region was just too small to devote a guidebook to. So they offered me the opportunity to write a guidebook for Nebraska because they didn't have one. And so I jumped at that chance because that's my home state. So I researched that, went out and hiked the trails, and in 2023, that Hiking Nebraska guidebook was published by Falcon Guides. And then through that process, they offered me the opportunity to write the Hiking Kansas guidebook, and then also to write the second edition to Hiking Iowa. And both those Iowa and Kansas guidebooks came out this summer. That's kind of my story. Right now, I'm working for a nonprofit organization in Western Iowa in the Loess Hills, working in conservation and outdoor recreation in some other areas. So, really lucky and fortunate to be able to work and live in a beautiful part of Western Iowa that I really love exploring.
It is a beautiful area. And yeah, we list several trails there on our website as well that we highly recommend. So, no, excellent. Thank you for the background. So, you haven't lived in Kansas, but close enough, and
Sure.
spent a lot of time in Nebraska. And of course, there are a lot of parallels between the two states. Now, outsiders may, and even many Midwesterners may think, hiking Kansas, like, is that a joke? Kind of like, skiing Kansas, and may think, did you draw the short straw, in the travel writers meeting? After writing this book, is there more to Kansas than perhaps is the popular perception?
There are beautiful places all over this planet. And just because, areas like Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa might have a reputation for being just, agricultural states with crop fields, they do have a lot to offer to people who are willing to go out and explore natural areas. And yeah, like the three guidebooks I wrote are for states, Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa, that are at the bottom three of the states in the United States with the least amount of publicly accessible land. So the landscape is, yeah, you do have to go out and search these places, and you might have to drive a ways to get to places, but they're worth the effort, and they're worth the exploration, because especially in these three states, those areas are kind of the last bastions of public areas or protected areas. And I think that makes it that much more important for people to go out and visit those places in Kansas so that they can appreciate those places and cultivate that desire to be stewards of those places, whether or not they live in those areas or not. But they can still be stewards of those places, whether they live in Kansas City or Topeka or Manhattan. They can still be stewards and support those places. And yeah, you look at Kansas, it has a diversity of ecosystems, from prairie, obviously, to areas in the southeast corner of the state with some great rock formations and other areas, and then out west with the high plains and the Smoky Hills. So while they don't have mountains like they do in Colorado, or spectacular trees like they do in the Pacific Northwest, um, they've got plenty of prairie and like Willa Cather said, it takes I, I'm going to butcher her quote, but it takes a soul, to love the prairie.
It is beautiful. I haven't, you reminded me of an interesting anecdote from my great grandmother who grew up in the fairly flat plains of her part of Southwest Missouri. And she had 8 children. And so she would spend a few months with each of them kind of in a rotation as she was older and she was a widow. And one of her children lived in Colorado. So she went and spent some time out there. And when she came back, they said, "What did you think of Colorado?" And she said, "Well, I really couldn't see anything because the mountains were in the way." So it really is a matter of perspective, right? What we can appreciate. Well, if you could only visit, say, if you could only visit 3 locations in Kansas, what would be your top 3 and why?
So I think, and the reason why kind of for all these three is that it's not just one hike or one hiking area, it's several to where you can kind of build like a weekend or like a short little vacation tours. And I think the number one, probably the Elk City Lake area, because one, you've got that long Elk River hiking trail that's uh, difficult and challenging, probably one of the most challenging hikes in the Midwest. But then there's also some great hikes at the state park there on the lake and also in the other areas. And those places are not what you think of stereotypical Kansas. Another one would be the Wilson Lake area, because there's a couple of great hikes there at the Wilson Lake area. And then probably third would be Western Kansas, because again, it kind of shatters that stereotype of Kansas, of just, cornfields and flat land, because you've got the Badlands out there at Little Jerusalem, Badlands State Park, the Smoky Hills Ranch, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and then historic Lake Scott Park. And so right there, you've got a great weekend trip with 3 great hikes where you'll see landforms and landscapes that you won't see in any other part of Kansas.
Those are great recommendations, and I do like the idea, and I try to do this, even on a smaller scale, is put several trails together. I always put too many on the agenda and am frustrated because I can't do them all. But particularly Western Kansas, because from Kansas City, it's a commitment, I know, 6 to 8 hours to reach that area. But you alluded to this, was if you have several hikes, planned, then you can spend 2 or 3 days and really have a great experience as opposed to driving 8 hours to just see one site and coming back.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of when I was, I spent many hours and many stressful hours trying to figure out, like, because the Falcon guys didn't have a guidebook for hiking Kansas, so I was just kind of trying to piece together, these different trails, different hikes to put together that kind of balanced not just geography, but also, you know, skill level for hiking and different ecosystems as well. Um, and in Western Kansas, it kind of limited itself to creating kind of or recommending and including hikes in the trail in the guidebook that would lend itself to going on a weekend trip for hiking, because yeah, like most of the population in Kansas lives in the Kansas City area or along I-70. So that is quite a haul for people to get out there. And so finding those places and having those places near each other was really conducive. And so yeah, that area around historic Lake Scott State Park and Smoky Valley Ranch and Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park, they're all real close together. So you can find a campground or find a bed and breakfast or wherever it may be and go spend a weekend out there and go hiking and really enjoy trails that are well marked, well taken care of. And because of the location, you're going to be solitary on a lot of those hikes. I remember all the hikes that I went to when I went on Kansas. I had a great time, but I particularly remember the Smoky Valley Ranch one because there was a coyote there that I was tracking, And I don't know if it was allowing me to track it or not, but it would, it was about 100, 150 yards in front of me, but it would walk away, keep walking and then stop and look back at me and yip at me, and I would follow it. And that was just such an enjoyable experience seeing that, because I was the only human that I knew of, and who knows the radius of square miles, but it was just a really cool experience to see that experience, to have that experience with that coyote.
You remind me of another thing. Of course, if I'm going to go to, Wyoming, I have expectations. I'm gonna see Devil's Tower. I'm gonna see towering peaks. To me, it's really exciting when, if I'm in an area where I'm not aware of some unique topography or geological formations or plant life, and I kind of stumble upon it, just like some of these areas out in western Kansas, from Interstate 70, as far as I can recall, you really can't see with your eyes anything, beyond a lot of just the agricultural, maybe some gently rolling hills once you get past the Flint Hills. But knowing just a little bit of distance from the interstate, there's all kinds of, worlds that open up. I think it's a fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, for people that would be interested in this guidebook, they're interested in those kinds of things, getting off the beaten path, getting off the interstate, and exploring those, state highways, county roads, so scenic byways that are, the scenic. I here in Iowa work on scenic byways, and so I'm a big proponent of scenic byways as a great way to explore different areas of your home state or a different state that you may be visiting, because they're a great jumping point to go explore hiking trails or historical landmarks or wherever it may be.
How did you pull this off? I mean, I'm sure you have quite a large volume of tax deductible, miles for your business expenses at the end of the year. Yeah, I mean, how did you get to all these different corners of Kansas? How long did it take you? It seems like an immense task.
Yeah, well, and it was because I was not only writing Kansas, but I was trying to figure out how to write the second edition of Hiking Iowa at the same time. So I was essentially writing two books at the same time. But that experience the summer before, the year before, writing Hiking Nebraska was a um, uh, huge benefit to me, because I kind of knew what to expect and kind of knew the things that I needed to research and to prepare for. And I kind of had a whole system set up for, pre-trip planning, during the trip planning, um, and a lot of it was just reaching out to the different land managers of this area and getting their recommendations on trails and getting updates from them on trails. Um, I had great help from my family. My father's a retired accountant, so he helped with, those things like those redeemable mileage and stipends and whatnot. They also helped watch my dog for me when I went on trips. And then, my partner Shelly, who I live with here in Western Iowa, she was a great help as well, and great support, because it was taxing, because I was writing these books and I also had a full-time day job during those times. So I would be traveling on weekends and driving a lot, and it was very stressful. It was hot. I don't like the summer, especially in the Midwest. It's my least favorite season because it's too hot and too humid and too buggy, too many ticks. But yeah, that support structure really helped me through it. But I think the biggest thing was just that curiosity that has been cultivated largely because of my parents in different places and exploring different places. I was just really curious and really excited to go out and explore Kansas, because I had been to Kansas before. I'd been to Kansas City, obviously, and some other parts, but I hadn't been to these other places. And so going to a place like Samara National Grassland, way in the southwest corner of Kansas, which was a huge long trip for me, but I absolutely loved it because of just the landscape there, and also because of the history, being kind of the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. And one thing that really helped me was kind of building like a reading list and like a listening list of podcasts and audiobooks to help learn about these places. Um, and that really helped, on those long drives to these places.
Well, your description it makes it sound every bit as difficult as I thought it would be. So yeah, you didn't have a tour bus or an entourage. It was just you and your vehicle and your GPS. To switch gears just a little bit, what would you say were some of your favorite trails closest to the Kansas City area?
I would say one thing that stands out is the Olathe Prairie Center was really nice. Just a beautiful area. right in the middle. There's development around it, but it's well preserved, well taken care of. Obviously, right in Kansas City, the Shawnee Mission Park is an excellent area, especially the South trails, because those are hiking only trails, and I really enjoyed those. And then the Lawrence area is not too far from Kansas City. You've got the Baker Wetlands right there, which I had a magical morning at the Baker Wetlands, and then the Woodridge Primitive Park, that hiking trail around there, which I think is an excellent place for people who are newcomers to backpacking. I think that trail is excellent for them to go out and test their skills about backpacking. In terms of that, I mean like hiking in with your camping gear and pitching a tent and doing that, because the loop is only, I think, 4.5, 5 miles long. So you're not too far from your car or a restroom if you need it to go get more water or more supplies. And so it's a great way to introduce newcomers to backpacking, but also children and families that might have an interest in backpacking but are maybe intimidated by going out to, whether it's other places in Kansas or Colorado or wherever it may be, to go on a backpacking trip. That's a great place, like a testing ground. And then obviously in Lawrence, you've got in the north of Lawrence, the University of Kansas Biological Station, which has some interesting trails there. And then the River Trail right along there is great as well. So those are kind of the ones in the KC area that are within reasonable driving distance that kind of stood out as well. But the whole Kansas City area, on both the Kansas side and the Missouri side, there's a wealth of different types of hiking trails and surfaces that can accommodate people of all kinds of abilities and interests.
That's a great listing of trails. And again, the book we're talking about here is Hiking Kansas. And you visited all these places. We started our website, Kansas City Hiker, in 2000 during the pandemic. And during that season, we were out exploring trails, trying to make the most of a challenging situation. And what I found was a lot of the information that were, for example, on government sites or county sites or even all trails was not good. So I'd go to a trail and it was like destroyed, impossible to navigate. Or there was a trail there maybe built 25 years ago. No one's done anything since. So I got the idea, let's create a totally original site where I visit and document everything. If I visit, I don't like it, I'm not going to write about it. I'm not going to publicize so someone else can have a bad experience. But you visited all these spots and you made, I think, a few caveats in the sense of like how to, be careful in certain areas so that you end up where you want to conclude. But people can have full confidence that they go to these places and they basically follow your guidelines, that they're not going to get horrendously lost or disappointed.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that was kind of the goal. And I kind of took the same tack that you did. Like if I didn't enjoy a place, I didn't include it in the book. For example, the very last hike that I went on in Kansas for this book is in the Kansas City area. I'm not going to name the place, but it was one that I really wanted to include in the book. But my experience there was not great. My dog got nailed by he must have sat down on a seed tick nest. And that was just a horrendous experience that affected me. There was all kinds of cobwebs. The trail was overgrown. And I was like, man, this is a bummer because I really wanted to include it in the book, but I'm not going to send people to a place where I had such a negative experience as well.
Sure.
So I did my best to include places that I thought people would enjoy. And also I did my best to try to write information that was accurate, that when people go to these places and they follow, whether the mile directions, that, they don't get lost, that it's as easy as it can be for them to have an enjoyable experience. Hopefully that will all, people read the book and follow these trails. That will be the case. I can't guarantee that people will have the same experiences that I had at these places I went and hiked. All I can do is just write about these places the best as I can and try to provide as accurate information as I can, and also kind of rely on the land managers who manage these places where the trails are to provide information about how often the trails are kept up, if there's any other updates that they may provide or suggestions as well.
The format of the guides is the directions that you lay out are very explicit and detailed, so And that in addition to maybe any other kind of digital guide that people may be using, it's a good combination.
Yeah, because I ran into the same thing that you like. The whole genesis of these three books was, in the Loess Hills, writing a guidebook about the Loess Hills, because I did the same thing as you. It was, I spent so much time trying to research places, even though I was familiar with the Loess Hills. I spent so much time trying to find information about hiking areas, and then I'd go to a hiking area and I'd follow a trail that someone had put on All Trails, and it just, or I'd follow, the map that was provided by the lane manager, and it was just like I was bushwhacking. I was like, no, that's how I came up with the idea to write, a guidebook about the Loess Hills, which turned into Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa.
The hiking Kansas book, there had not been a Falcon guide for that state.
No, there hadn't. No.
Okay, so that's new, and that's excellent. And then since 2020, you have written Nebraska and Iowa versions as well. Excellent. Well, those sound like definitely also worth acquiring, because we definitely recommend some trails that are at least in the border area of Missouri and Kansas, and in Nebraska and Iowa, some beautiful hikes there. So I will look forward to checking those out. Our guest has been Seth Brooks, and again, the book is Hiking Kansas. Highly recommended if you want to get to know some well-known and trails that are not as well known but worth visiting in the Sunflower State. Seth, anything else you want to add about the book?
Just that you can pick it up at most online retailers. I tried my best to include a balance, like I said, of geography, of skill level, of ecosystems. I was really happy that there's a Nature Conservancy property in the Flint Hills, in the southern Flint Hills, that's including this book, that was literally open probably a month or two to the public before I actually went there myself and hiked the trails. And so I'm really excited about that, because I think the Flint Hills in Kansas, I think it's the jewel and the hiking crown of Kansas. I mean, there's other great hiking areas, but I really enjoy those places like the Flint Hills in Kansas, the Loess Hills in western Iowa, the Sand Hills in Nebraska, that only exist because in the past people didn't think they were valuable areas, or it was too difficult to turn them into farmland, because in the Flint Hills, because of the Flint, or in the Loess Hills, because of the steepness of the Loess Hills, or in the Sand Hills, because it's just not productive land. And the only reasons why those are, big protected habitats and areas is because at one point they were deemed not worthy. But in my eyes, those places are worthy of our attention and of our protection. And yeah, I was really happy to include that place that the TNC owns in the Flint and then southern Flint Hills in this book.
Excellent. Yeah. And some of them are lonely places. And as you said, those can make for some very unique hiking experiences. So absolutely. Well, thank you again. And the book is Hiking Kansas by Falcon Guides. And you can pick it up in many online locations. So you can learn more about Kansas hikes and hikes in the greater Kansas City area at kansascityhiker.com. And thanks for watching and listening.